Okay, in this discussion, we're dealing with non-exempt employees. We know those are under the Fair Labor Standards Act. We are encountering a non-exempt employee here that has a fluctuating work week. They work a differing number of hours, but at a fixed salary. That's not uncommon, and the very fact that they have that situation does not automatically make them an exempt employee. There's a much more complicated test we should be aware of now, having discussed that. And it's a dangerous assumption to inappropriately place someone in an exempt status instead of non-exempt because of liability. So we want to be very careful about that. And we're not doing that here. These are non-exempt employees. We must follow the Fair Labor Standards Act. So this agreement here, we have a fluctuating work week, a fixed salary. What do we do with overtime? And we're told here that we calculate overtime by dividing the normal salary by the total hours worked. That would give a different rate of pay for each week if you have a different number of hours each week. In other words, a fluctuating number of hours. 35 hours one week, 38 another week, 36 another week. You'd wind up with a different hourly salary by that calculation. Whatever that is, in any particular week there is an overtime situation, a 50% overtime premium has to be paid for any hours worked over 40 in spite of the fluctuating work week agreement, because the federal law says if it's over 40, we don't care what other agreements are. Even if you didn't work 40 the week before, if you do work over 40 this week, you must be paid overtime. So that is one technique to deal with this. The other technique has to do with this practice of dividing the fixed salary by 40 hours, using that as the basis to determine the overtime premium. So that's a second technique, and that particular technique would then you'd have a consistent and steady overtime premium every time this happened because you computed it differently, both acceptable. This third one, called the BELO plan, it's an alternative. It came about because of a lawsuit in which it was challenged. This practice was challenged, and it was determined to be acceptable in certain situations. For very irregular work weeks is when it should happen. There are some conditions here about non-disciplinary absences, etc. The guaranteed compensation can't be for more than 60 hours. We calculate the salary as the wage rate multiplied by the maximum number of hours, and then we add 50% for overtime. So this is a different calculation than these, and we'll try to look through some examples of this to get a better understanding of these and how they would operate. So remember the environment we're in. This is not a normal I work for $12 an hour environment. This is an environment where we have a non-exempt employee, where we have to worry about overtime issues, and they have a fluctuating work week depending on the needs of the job. They work a different amount of hours possibly each week, and they're paid a fixed amount for that. But if they get over 40 under the federal law, we have to deal with that. So then in the first approach to this calculation, we see an example here where we have a standard 35-hour week, paid a salary of $1,080. Last week he worked more than that. He worked 39 hours and was paid his normal salary, since the agreement with the employer was, if you work between 35 and 40, your salary is still the same. So the needs of the job were that you had to work a few more hours that week. So we didn't go over the 40 hours. We didn't have an overtime situation if you only worked 39 hours. But if you worked perhaps 43 hours, here's what has to happen. We take the regular pay up to 40 hours, but we're dividing it here by the agreed standard between the employer and the employee, which is not 40, it's 35. So we arrive at this as the regular rate, $30.86. Therefore, the overtime premium is 1.5 times that. And that is then used when we encounter this situation here where we have 3 hours of overtime. So that's where this overtime pay calculation comes from. That is added to the base fixed salary of $1,080 to get the gross pay. Now that is a calculation based on the methodology of using the agreed upon standard to find the hourly rate. I want to look at this in a little bit more depth here. So let me pull up another slide. So what I'm doing here is this is just yet another reminder to you that of this issue of rounding that I brought up in the prior lecture, prior integrity discussion, and I'm not going to keep bringing this up, but I want to make sure that you don't overlook it. In this calculation, look, we did this division. We divided $1,080 by 35 hours of the standard work week here. So that calculation up here in Excel, we're doing it here. We're taking this number, the 1,080, dividing it by 35. This is actually the number that we come up with, 30.85714. That has to be rounded. So in this yellow cell here, I've put the round function on it, round it to 2 decimal places, and that's where we come up with this $30.86 per hour. Don't forget that, because if we cause this to display fewer decimals, like if I decrease the number of decimals, let me show you that here. So here I have the Excel sheet. I'm on this cell right here that is not rounded yet. I could, what if my display was set so I'm decreasing the decimals here, decreasing. Look, I decrease it down to $30.86. So when you're looking at Excel, you look at that and say, oh, well, that must be exactly the answer. Don't be fooled by that. The display rounds for you so that it can display. You are likely looking at a different number. So if we keep increasing that, we can increase it so far that Excel does this. It says, hey, I can't show you all those. You're telling me to show it to me, but I can't because it's not wide enough. So when that happens, we just widen it out, and then we can start to see all those fractions. So you have to be aware of that, and you get fooled by that many times because you kind of forget it, and then you look at an Excel display that it's set for 2 decimal places, and you look at that number and you say, oh, well, that's the correct exact number. Actually, no, it isn't. To get the correct exact number that you want with a rounding applied to it, you have to either manually round it, or better yet, start to use this Excel function that forces whatever is in the number, and here's the number. It is actually a formula. It's B4 divided by B6. It forces it to display 2 decimal places. Now if I use this in any calculation downstream, it's going to bring in $30.86, period. It's not going to bring in this number here, which is $30.85, 0.7143, on and on and on. A much different number, and especially when you multiply it by a larger number, you get dramatic differences in the totals. So I'm just pointing that rounding issue out to you again in the context of using Excel, which I want you to use. You need to learn how to use it in an accounting career. Just be very aware of that, and don't be fooled by it too many times, because boy, it's frustrating when you submit an answer and you get knocked points off for rounding issues. We did that first example now using this technique here, where we're dividing the normal salary by the total hours worked. Let's take this one. Let's do this one next. I just want to clarify what I just said a little bit here in these various methods that are being laid out to deal with these fluctuating work weeks. The one we just did with 35 hours would have been more like this example or this discussion here, not this one. This is the one we're going to do next. But in this one, instead of using 40 hours, we divided it by the standard that they had to come to agree on, that your normal work week is 35 hours. That's how we approached this one. That brought us to this example where we're taking this amount, we're dividing it by the standard. Because it was 35 and not 40 in this particular situation, that's where we wound up. Now we're going to use the alternative method. And the alternative method is simply to take the hours that were worked in the time period, whether they are 35, 36, 40, 43, whatever, and we're going to divide that into the fixed salary. And we get we would wind up then obviously with a different amount in each week. So let's look at that example. In this case, we have this particular weekly earnings with a fluctuating work week. This employee worked 48 hours. So the first thing we do in this technique, and what you're going to see in this technique, is it is not to the advantage of the employee. It's to the advantage of the employer. And as a result, like it's stated right here, some states are on to this and they say, no, you're not going to do this. In the states where it would be allowed, it most certainly would need to be agreed upon by the employee and disclosed to the employee, because it can come to the disadvantage of the employee. Because look, to get the overtime rate, we're taking total promised compensation divided by whatever hours we worked, including the overtime hours. So the more overtime hours you work, the lower the regular rate is. That's to your disadvantage. And so be aware of this issue and realize that how you calculate it, number one. But number two, it's one of those areas that some states are saying, no, let's just not do that anymore. Let's not even bring that technique up. It is still possible to do it if it's disclosed and everybody understands it. So we took the number of hours worked here, the 48 hours, divided into the regular fixed amount to get a rate that is true only for this pay period. And so that rate would change when you work a different number of hours. Okay, so then the premium, the overtime premium, is half of that regular rate that is unique to this pay period. There it is. So because this employee worked overtime hours worked 8 overtime hours, 8 overtime hours times 770, the overtime premium, that's the extra pay. And the irony here for the employee is if you worked fewer overtime hours, you get paid more per hour for those overtime hours. So it has that negative result, and as a result, I think it's going to eventually disappear as a technique, but it's still there, and we need to be aware of it going forward. And you need to be aware of why it's to the disadvantage, and it's displayed right here. The bigger this gets, the smaller the regular rate is, and therefore the smaller they have to pay in an overtime premium. Now in this example, we're going to get back to what I think is more common and what you would expect more, that it's pretty straightforward and standard, not to the advantage of one side or the other, employer-employee. And we simply take the promised rate here per week and divide it by a standard work week of 40 hours, and we get our regular rate that way. So that's consistent. It's the same all the time. It doesn't change unless, of course, the weekly salary changes. Our overtime premium is the same. Whatever overtime hours we earn, get a rate of pay that's consistent and steady. That overtime premium stays the same. So this would be a logical standard way of doing it. And you can compare this to this method here, where we took the 35 hours because that was the agreed upon rate. That's a standard work week for this employee. That's different than using the technique where we just take a standard 40-hour week divided into the fixed amount to arrive at it. Both of these are standard. They're not to the advantage one way or the other, this one and this one. It's just dividing that up either by the agreed upon amount of hours or 40 hours. This second one takes this turn where it says, oh, well, let's just divide it by the hours worked to get an average rate for the whole period of time, and then we'll figure your premium. That's a little bit different. Okay, now we're going to move on to a different way of paying employees. A piece rate. You're not paid by the hour, you're paid by what you produce. Historically, very common technique. Very common in some subcontracting trades, maybe in the textile industry. You can probably find lots of examples where piece rate, well, in agriculture, the bushels you pick and the amount of harvest you bring in as a laborer in harvest is regularly structured as a piece rate, as what you produce. So, just because you're in a piece rate situation, the Fair Labor Standards Act is not going to allow you to have to sit as an employee and wait for something to happen, like a production cycle to come, like a truck to come in and bring in more bins if you're picking apples, like things like that. They require you, and I'm using agriculture maybe inappropriately because, as we know from previous discussions, agriculture has all of these exemptions from the Fair Labor Standards Act. So I probably shouldn't say agriculture. I should say some other piecework situation, like the number of square feet of drywall that you hang in a subcontracting trade. At any rate, Fair Labor Standards say that when you're under that act and you're in a non-agricultural piece rate environment, it is important that you still get paid for non-productive time when it's through no fault of your own. You can't produce, you're waiting for something to happen. And the situation where you work overtime hours, you fall under that need to be paid 50% more for the work that you accomplish in overtime. So in that situation now, we have two techniques, method A and method B, of calculating overtime. Let's get to the end result. They won't wind up with the same number. They produce different results. Both methods are acceptable, and we're going to go look at these methods here in a little bit more detail. So in method A, units produced times the piece rate. So you hang so many sheets of drywall, so many square feet, you get so much per square foot. That's your regular earnings. Take those regular earnings, divide it by the total hours you work to accomplish that, to compute this hourly rate, and the reason we're computing that is to deal with overtime. Okay, the hourly rate then times the overtime premium of 0.5 or 1/2 gives us an overtime premium. So then we take our regular earnings that we arrived at by the piece rate, the amount produced, times the piece rate, we get the regular earnings, and then we find out how many overtime hours you work based on how many hours you were there, multiply that times the overtime premium. We get an extra amount added on for overtime, which we arrived at by using the regular earnings that are derived from piecework. So that would equal gross pay. Method B, a little bit different. We take the units produced in 40 hours. So we very much say you're paid per piece produced for the 40 hours that you're here, period. And then if you work overtime, you are paid for the pieces you produce at a rate of 1.5 times the piece rate, or you paid that 50% premium in an overtime situation. So it seems to me that if I asked you before you understood what the methods were, how to do this, I think most of us would probably arrive at this method right here, which says let's just have you work 40 hours, and whatever you produce times the agreed upon piece rate is what you get paid. And then if we ask you to work more, to stay longer than 40 hours, we realize that we're going to pay you 1.5 times that. We may have a need as an employer to have you do that. This is a logical, method B is a logical solution for that. Method A is also, it's not illogical, but it does result in a changing hourly rate based on how productive you are. And if you're really productive and you produce a lot during that time period, it changes the hourly rate. If you didn't produce a lot, you get a different rate. So both methods are acceptable. Let's take a look. Remember now, rounding is an issue and has to be dealt with. We're going to round to 2 decimal places in these calculations. So here's our piece rate. We're going to use the first technique, method A. This piecework in this situation is inspections. You have to inspect units, and you're paid for each one you inspect. This particular fact set here says 4,812 units were inspected in a 47.25 hour week. 600 of those units were produced in extra hours. Well, we're going to deal with the totals here. We know the piece rate is 12 cents per inspection. Calculate the gross pay. Well, the method A calculation simply tells us to take all the units produced, multiply it times the piece rate. Here's your pay for that pay period at the regular rate, at the 12 cents per hour for all of those you produce. So that's the beginning. But because we worked over 40 hours, we must deal with overtime. So how do we get the overtime? Well, let's take what you produced, the total gross wages for your production, divide it by the total hours you worked to achieve that production. We get an average hourly rate. From that, we calculate the overtime premium, and that overtime premium is multiplied by the 7.25 hours, those hours over 40, to get the add-on to the base gross piecework wages. 577 gets this add-on to come up with this 621 gross. Now, in the method B, we're going to use this information here to find the overtime part. In method B, we simply take our hours, or our pieces produced. Where did we get this number, 4,212? Well, we took the total produced minus those produced in overtime. We just want to get back to, well, what did you do in 40 hours? We did 4,012. We multiply that times 12 cents per hour piece rate, and then we add to that the 600 that you produced in overtime times the regular piece rate, boosted up by the 1.5 overtime rate. The 50% premium is inherent in that, and we get a total then of the 40-hour total, the 7.5 overtime hour total, $613.44. So these both seem fair, they seem logical, they're both acceptable. You can decide which one you think would be the most advantageous, and it just depends on the custom and the practice of the firm that you're working for as to which rate is used. But importantly, in method A, this number changes based on what happened, what that particular employee accomplished during that time period. And so in method A, if they didn't accomplish very much, if they didn't produce very much in the regular time period, their hourly rate isn't going to be very high, and they're not going to get very much in overtime. In other words, the 50% premium is not going to be as much as it would have had they been very productive during that time period. So there's that dynamic to method A just to keep in mind. Here we're going to look at a second fact set. We're going to do that piecework calculation with method A and method B. We have an inspection rate of piece. We're paid by the piece, 8 cents per unit. This employee inspected 6,897 units. They worked overtime, more than 40 hours. In that situation, 423 of these were calculated in overtime. So using the two methods, let's tackle this gross pay calculation. So in the first one, you produced so many units, this is what we pay you per unit, that's your regular pay. But because you worked overtime, 3.5 hours of overtime, we're going to calculate the overtime rate. So we take what we're going to pay you at the base rate without overtime, divided by the total hours you worked, including overtime. This is your average hourly rate that you achieved by your production. From that, we get your premium. From that premium, we can give you your 3.5 hours times that premium to add on to your base earnings and give you your legal overtime pay, approved and acceptable method by Fair Labor Standards. Method B, we simply take those produced during the 40 hours. How did we come up with this number? We simply took this total minus the data set that tells us that 423 of those were produced in overtime. So we reduce that 6,897 down to that number times the piece rate agreed upon, and then we take the overtime production pieces times the piece rate times 1.5 to get the overtime premium. We wind up with this gross here. So this resulted in a higher gross than the method B technique. That happens. That's just a result of the choice of the methods. Typically in these employment agreements, it's understood or it's disclosed to the employee that the method being used is one or the other. Both are acceptable. Let's talk briefly about special incentive plans. Not a lot of calculation we need to worry about here. We just need to be aware that this happens, and it would need to be calculated if you encountered it. They're incentive to get workers to produce more. They're used carefully because they can be a disincentive as to quality and those kinds of things that are always an issue in production and employment. But the computation of payroll is based on the different rates for the different quantities of production. So an example, you get paid 18 cents a unit for all your inspections up to 2,000. But if you can get some more inspections done above 2,000, and do them well, obviously, we're going to boost that piece rate up to 24 cents. And if you can get over 3,500 units inspected, we're going to boost it to 36 cents. So these are not uncommon. They're carefully used. Employees, I think, are incented by that, and it helps them improve their production and improve their paycheck. Here's an example of a schedule of this blade polisher position at Chu Wang Inc. has this variety of earnings, piecework earnings, based on how many blades you get done in that particular activity, and it scales from 1.5 cents up to almost 2.5 cents for that production. And almost always they attempt to set a daily standard. This is what we expect of you. This is what we expect you to get done. Employees are expensive, and if you have an employee that comes in and has very low production consistently, but is holding a slot and using resources and using physical capacity that isn't up to close to some standard, then that employee is going to probably be asked to retrain, to improve, to try and get it up so that the capacity they're dedicating to that employee, the workstation, and all the costs associated with that are productive enough to justify that position. We need to talk a little bit about commissions too. These are regular occurrences in payroll that we need to deal with. It can be used in many different combinations. A stated percentage of revenue. It can be added onto a base salary. We fall under the minimum wage rule. We've got to make sure that we pay minimum wages. There are some outside salespeople who are exempt from Fair Labor Standards Act. But aside from that, this issue of commissions can be applied and be an actual issue for those who are under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So looking at this example here, Sam sold $40,000 of a product. His quota was $31,500. He gets 2% in excess of his quota. Here's his annual base salary of $30,000. That's to sell this level. He sold more, so the difference between his quota and what he actually sold is going to trigger the payment of this extra commission of 2%. He gets paid biweekly, so if we're being asked to calculate his total pay, we first take his annual, we break it down to his paycheck, and there are 26 paychecks in his annual salary. That's his base earnings. Then we find the differential to get his commission. It's what he sold minus his quota. Multiply it times the percentage commission that he earns, $170. Combine the two. That's a calculation of his gross pay. So, interestingly, again, here we're reminded that very often we need to get it up to the annual salary, which is a given here, and then break it back down into a paycheck amount. And if that paycheck amount were semi-monthly, we would be dividing by 24. If it was monthly, we would be dividing by 12. Here we're dividing it by 26 because it's biweekly. It's every 2 weeks. Okay, so that's a good example of a commission calculation, reminding ourselves that it is for those folks who have a commission agreement in their employment agreement, and they still fall under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Here's yet another example of a commission. This is just based on annual numbers. So here's her annual base salary, $35,000. So that's part of her total down here. She earned extra because of the commissions that she earned. She sold over $1 million. Her base was $800,000. So we have a $230,000 sales above her quota. She gets by agreement 6% of that. So there's the add-on, the $13,800 added on to her annual salary. That's what she earned in total annual salary. So a very simple, another additional example of a commission. Let's talk here about non-discretionary bonuses. Non-discretionary bonuses are known to the employer and the employee, especially the employee. It doesn't depend on what happens. It's a bonus, but it doesn't depend on, no, I think you deserve it, I don't think you deserve it, something that's decided later on. A discretionary bonus would be something like that. So they're set up as incentives, and they must be added to the wages for the week. So we calculate overtime in this situation. And we need to do that, and let's follow this particular example here where this employee earned $13.50 an hour. He also earns a safety performance bonus of $85. He worked 44 hours. So in this particular situation, we have this non-discretionary bonus, this $85. It was an incentive to deal with the issue of safety at the employee level. And he also has overtime. So we have to bring all these things into it. And let's take a look at what his gross pay would be in this particular situation. So he is working $13.50 an hour times all the hours that he worked, including overtime. That's his base. Plus he earns the bonus of $85. And this is the important piece here, where we're being asked to add that non-discretionary bonus to his regular earnings to arrive at his regular rate of pay from which we compute his overtime premium. That's the key issue here. Because it's non-discretionary, we've got to add it on to get to that calculation. Otherwise, if we didn't add it on, this would be lower, and the Act and the regulation of the Act says no, if it's non-discretionary, you got to get it in there because that was part of his regular earnings. So we arrive at his regular earnings this way by adding that $85 bonus onto it. Then we divide by all the hours worked, including overtime, to get his regular rate, and then we can get his premium. His premium is $7.72. It is that number in part because of this bonus. If you forgot to add that, this would be a lower number and it would be in violation because the bonus is non-discretionary. He earns it not based on a decision made at the end of the pay period. So his overtime premium is $7.72, $30.81. So he gets his $13.50 an hour times 44 hours. Then he gets added to that the $85 bonus. Then he gets added to that his overtime premium. And the overtime premium inherently includes this $85 as a basis to arrive at his regular rate and then his overtime rate. Okay, then here are yet two more examples of this non-discretionary bonus. And remember, what is it? It's, well, if you do certain things, you get the bonus. It isn't, if you do certain things and I think you perform well and I think about it as your manager and I want to decide based on the profitability of the firm and how well things are going for us to award you and you and you a bonus. That's discretionary. This is non-discretionary. You do it, you earn it. And so we have to make sure that this production bonus of $27.60 was added to his regular rate, regular pay, which is hours worked times the regular rate. Knowing when we're doing this, we've got a 6-hour overtime issue we're going to have to deal with. But to get to that, we got to add the non-discretionary bonus to it to get our total earnings divided by our total hours to get our regular rate of pay. From that, we get our overtime premium. and then we can multiply that times our 6 hours that we need to add on for overtime, and we can then get to the regular gross pay. In this second example, all it's doing is making you break down an annual bonus, perfect attendance, non-discretionary, you never miss a day, you get the bonus. We have to break that down into the pay periods that are involved in this particular one. And so we take that annual bonus, perfect attendance bonus, that results in a $42 a week part of that bonus. And so in this particular situation, he worked 42 hours each week, so there was $1 bonus in each hour, 42 hours each week divided by the apportionment of that bonus to each week of work. Therefore, the overtime premium is 50 cents, half of the $1 bonus. And so the 2 hours of overtime that he worked each week in this problem get a 50% premium multiplied by the total number of weeks that he worked 2 hours overtime, because we're said he worked 42 hours each week of the year. He gets additional overtime earnings of $52. So that's a maybe a little rare, but I'm sure it can be encountered regularly. Situation where we have to make sure we deal with that bonus, and these issues come up all the time because managers are constantly trying to think of ways to incent employees, to encourage employees to do things like perfect attendance or job safety or levels of production, all those kinds of things. And when you do those things as managers, you have to remember to add those to the employer's calculations when they're doing overtime. Okay, then the very last thing we need to mention here for Chapter 2, this issue of profit-sharing plans, we don't have any calculations to do in this example here in this lecture, but we need to be aware that profit-sharing plans are discretionary, where the employees share in corporate profits, and they can get that profit sharing in the form of a cash payment. Profit may be paid into a retirement account, would be a way of sharing profits, maybe distributed as stock. There are standards established by the Department of Labor to deal with this. It's more involved and more complex. We're not going to get into those details now. We have plenty to deal with aside from that. But let's be aware of it, and be aware, as you might expect, the issue of regulation and law involving all aspects of the employment situation come to play, and we need to be aware of that in profit-sharing plans as well.